The pages were brittle when I found them, creased, smoke, scented. The ink faded to the brown of dried blood. Someone had meant for them to survive. Someone had meant for us to read. And what she confessed was not merely crime, but an idea. Her name was never meant to be remembered. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. In 1847, a packet of letters and legal abstracts was deposited in the courthouse of Madison County, Alabama, bound with a cord of waxed hemp and labeled simply KCC, W, Vess Property Rachel. No record of a verdict survives. The papers were rediscovered in 1938 by a WPA archivist sorting neglected land deeds. Inside were fragments of testimony, medical observations, and a single unsigned confession written in a disciplined, elegant hand. The script was French in style, precise, old world, and at times almost lyrical. The subject of those documents, the woman later called Rachel Duval, was identified not by surname but by ownership. Rachel, property of Mr. Alaric Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh's estate no longer exists. The last stones of the main house were cleared in 1921 to make way for a cotton gin cooperative. But in 1847, it was known throughout northern Alabama for its refinement, a place where Enlightenment men boasted of rational improvement, of new methods in agriculture, medicine, and discipline. The Kavanaugh family had once been minor aristocrats in Virginia, descended from French Huguenots, and they brought with them a habit of record keeping, diaries, weather charts, medical accounts of enslaved workers' illnesses, all preserved meticulously until the war scattered the line. Through these papers we can trace the outline of Rachel Duval's life, purchased from a mobile broker in 1843, aged 23, described as mixed complexion, literate in English and French, skilled in domestic needlework. The broker's note added, temperate and reserved, of uncommon intelligence. Those who met her later would use another phrase, calculating. At first, Rachel served within the household as lady's maid to Mrs. Eleanor Kavanaugh, a widow of fragile constitution. The widow's husband, Dr. Alaric Kavanaugh, maintained a small practice in Huntsville and wrote occasional essays on moral hygiene for the Southern Medical Journal. He was a man of theories. He believed intellect was measurable by cranial shape and that servitude, properly directed, was a civilizing science. Rachel became both his experiment and his mirror. Dr. Kavanaugh's surviving notes reveal an unsettling mixture of fascination and unease. In a marginal entry dated August 1844, he wrote, "Subject demonstrates rapid comprehension and subtle humor, qualities not uncommon among quadroons of French extraction. I suspect the admixture of European blood contributes to heightened nervous sensibility. She reads when unsupervised. I must discourage this." Eleanor Kavanaugh's own diary, preserved only in fragments, shows an opposite response, a kind of reliance bordering on affection. She called Rachel, "my only calm presence." Neighbors would later whisper that Rachel soothed the widow's ailments better than any physician's tonic, that she managed the household, corresponded in her mistress's stead, and gradually came to know every habit, fear, and secret of the Kavanaugh line. By 1846, the first cracks appeared. A cousin named Jonathan Wren, recently returned from New Orleans, began courting the widow's trust with promises of investment in river transport. He stayed often at the estate and took a particular interest in Rachel's composure. Surviving correspondence between Wren and a partner reveals resentment. The maid governs this house. The doctor dotes on her intellect. The mistress depends upon her nerves. One cannot so much as enter the library without that woman's silent notice. It was during this period that the Kavanaugh fortune began its decline. Quietly, invisibly at first. Receipts misfiled, letters delayed, accounts misplaced. A loan defaulted because the notice never arrived. Every misfortune appeared bureaucratic, never malicious. Yet witnesses later remarked that Rachel was always present, calm and helpful, offering explanations before questions were asked. In November 1846, Kavanaugh collapsed while performing an autopsy at his practice. Local physicians attributed his death to apoplexy brought on by overwork. Eleanor withdrew to her room for 3 weeks. Rachel managed all correspondence, arranging burial, notifying creditors, receiving condolences. When she finally brought Eleanor out again, the widow seemed diminished, uncertain of her surroundings, whispering to visitors that her husband's death had been foretold in dreams. Those who spoke with her afterward recalled her gaze, disoriented, tremulous, and Rachel at her shoulder, guiding her gently through each encounter. By spring of 1847, the estate was encumbered by debt. Jonathan Wren petitioned for control of Eleanor's finances, claiming the widow's health rendered her unfit. A hearing was scheduled for June. Among the documents submitted was a letter, supposedly written by Eleanor herself, confessing to long-term moral indiscretion with her late husband's assistant. The handwriting was convincingly hers, the ink, the same formula she used. The letter destroyed her credibility. The assistant fled the county. Within a month, Jonathan Wren took possession of the estate. Eleanor was confined to a sanitarium near Mobile. Rachel, described as property attached to said household, was sold through intermediary to a Louisiana trader for transport west. The Kavanaugh case might have ended there, an unfortunate domestic tragedy typical of its time, if not for a marginal annotation, found decades later, in the county's physician register. Beside Dr. Kavanaugh's death record appears an unsigned note, cause of death uncertain, no autopsy specimen preserved, household maid known to have studied anatomy under Dr. Kavanaugh's supervision. Who wrote that line is unknown. What is known is that 2 years later, in 1849, similar correspondence and financial collapses afflicted the households of the Valcourts of Baton Rouge and the Trenholm family near Lafayette. Families with no obvious connection to one another, except a single name appearing in plantation ledgers, Rachel. From these overlapping traces, the court petitions, physicians' notes, letters of condolence, and one fragment of her own confession, we begin to perceive a pattern. Not a series of accidents, but a method. A deliberate study of human frailty conducted under the guise of obedience. A strategy that required intelligence, patience, and absolute invisibility. Rachel Duval was not a witch, nor a seductress in the crude sense, so often attributed to enslaved women. She was something rarer as an analyst of power. She learned that the white families who imagined themselves masters were governed entirely by vanity, secrecy, and fear of social exposure. She exploited those fears as any strategist would exploit terrain. Every rumor she seeded was precise, every omission of truth deliberate. Where others prayed for deliverance, she practiced dismantling, quietly, rationally, one household at a time. The later historian Dr. Miriam Cobb, who examined the recovered documents in 1968, described Rachel as a product of paradox, educated enough to comprehend her enslavement fully, confined enough to convert intellect into revenge. Yet the surviving sources resist simplification. There are hints of something beyond vengeance, a philosophy, perhaps even a political consciousness forming in isolation. One sentence from her partial confession, preserved by a transcriptionist before the original vanished into restricted archives, reads, "They think the chain lies upon my wrists, but it lies upon their reason. They built a world that cannot bear the truth of my mind." Whether those are her exact words, or a later embellishment, cannot be proved. But they express the essence of what made Rachel Duval more feared than any weapon. In the decades since, folklorists in northern Alabama have told a different version. The legend of the quiet girl of Huntsville, who walked through houses like a shadow and left only ruin behind. In that version, her motives dissolve into superstition. The curse of a wronged woman, the ghost of a Creole witch. But the paper trail suggests no magic, only method, an intellect turned against its captors with terrifying precision. And so we begin not with myth, but with documents. The fragments you will hear in this series come from those primary sources: court ledgers, estate inventories, medical notes, and the fading confession itself. Taken together, they reveal how one woman, born into freedom, thrust into bondage, and trained in the language of her oppressors, transformed intellect into retribution, and why 3 of Alabama's most respected families collapsed within a single decade, leaving only silence in her wake. What follows is reconstruction, not invention. Every date, every location, and every name altered here exists only to protect descendants of the original families whose archives remain sealed. But the pattern, the method, the warning remains the same. By the autumn of 1847, the atmosphere at Oak Ridge Plantation carried the heavy stillness that precedes a storm. The cotton had been picked, the ledgers closed, and Daniel Kenshaw, the plantation's master, believed himself to be entering another year of prosperity. Yet beneath the polished veneer of his success, his estate rested upon fragile illusions that Rachel had already begun to unravel. Margaret Kenshaw, Daniel's eldest daughter, was the only member of the household whose intuition sensed the quiet dissonance spreading through Oak Ridge. She noticed Rachel's manner not as overt rebellion, but as a delicate orchestration of perception. Rachel never contradicted, never disobeyed. Her authority came instead from flawless competence. She remembered everything: dates, debts, shipments, correspondence. She ran the household with precision that seemed almost mechanical. Even Daniel, proud of his efficiency, had come to rely upon her records more than his own memory. It began subtly, a misplaced invoice found just when Daniel needed to recall it, a polite suggestion whispered to a clerk, a reminder about a visiting factor that arrived a moment before a costly oversight. Rachel made herself indispensable. She became, in essence, the mind of Oak Ridge. Margaret would later write in her private journal, "It was not her words that unsettled me, but her silences." She listened as if she gathered the threads of every conversation to weave something unseen. Rachel's influence did not manifest as flattery or seduction in any conventional sense. It was intellectual seduction, a kind that made her masters believe their best ideas were their own. She planted notions with careful restraint, allowing Daniel to nurture them into conviction. Every move was deliberate, every silence weighted with strategy. A study in weakness. Rachel's strategy required observation first, action later. She understood that Daniel Kenshaw was not a man to be moved by emotion. He valued logic and discipline. Thus, she sought his weakness where logic ended, in pride. Oak Ridge, like many Alabama plantations, thrived upon reputation as much as yield. Daniel's prosperity was public theater. His position in Limestone County's hierarchy depended on constant display of control, perfect crops, perfect ledgers, perfect children. Rachel saw through this facade before anyone else. She noticed the irregularities in accounts, the private borrowing disguised as routine transactions, the way Daniel's handwriting trembled when calculating interest. He was overextended, gambling on land speculation and market stability. To Rachel, this was not mere curiosity, it was leverage. She recorded the pattern quietly, building a map of his vulnerability. Her revenge was never improvised, it was architecture. Each family's downfall a construction of her deliberate design. Margaret's suspicion grew. She saw Rachel converse with field hands in ways that seemed too deliberate for casual oversight. Once, she found her in the study, reorganizing files Daniel had sealed himself. Rachel's excuse, that she was ensuring proper order, seemed plausible. Yet Margaret sensed a deeper intention. She moved. Margaret later recalled, like a woman who already owned the place. By December, Rachel's quiet investigation bore fruit. The plantation's books revealed consistent short-term borrowing from multiple creditors, interest compounding faster than profits. The truth was evident to her trained eye. Daniel Kenshaw was drowning in invisible debt. His empire was a polished mask covering slow decay. She said nothing. Not yet. The arrival of James Havel, in January 1848, fortune delivered the next piece Rachel required. James Havel, a businessman once partnered with Samuel Rutledge, whose collapse she herself had quietly engineered months earlier. Havel arrived at Oak Ridge under pretense of proposing a factoring partnership that could ease Daniel's financial burden. His desperation was disguised by confidence, but Rachel recognized the scent of ruin immediately. She served tea during his visit, head bowed, eyes lowered, yet listening to every word. Havel spoke of opportunity, of expanding credit lines, of shared prosperity. To Daniel, it sounded like deliverance. To Rachel, it sounded like a spark waiting for dry tinder. After Havel departed, she found Daniel alone in his study, the glow of optimism still burning in his expression. It was then that Rachel made her first decisive strike. "Sir," she said quietly, "I do not presume to speak in business, but I once served at Fairmont. I heard things of Mr. Havel. He destroyed Mr. Rutledge through deception. A partnership became a trap." The statement was pure invention, or rather, strategic rearrangement of truths. Rutledge's ruin had indeed involved deception, but it was Rachel's own. Now she turned her earlier lie into a weapon against a new target. Daniel listened. He respected Rachel's intelligence even if he could not acknowledge it openly. Over the following days, she nourished his doubts with casual remarks, subtle enough to avoid notice yet persistent enough to fester. By the end of the month, Daniel declined Havel's offer. The rejection set off a chain of resentments Rachel had foreseen perfectly. Havel blamed the Rutledges for poisoning Daniel's opinion, deepening a rivalry already aflame. By March, the county's three most powerful families were no longer connected by commerce, but divided by suspicion. All according to Rachel's plan. The family fracture still, Rachel was not satisfied. Business rivalry was only the framework of her revenge. True destruction required emotional implosion, families turning inward against themselves. For that, she needed a personal fault line. She found it in Daniel's son, William. William Kenshaw was young, idealistic, and dangerously honest. Unlike his father, he had no interest in profit or hierarchy. He had fallen in love with Anna Pritchard, the daughter of a modest shopkeeper from Athens. A match far beneath the Kenshaw name. Their courtship had been secret, their marriage by February 1848 already complete. Anna was with child. Rachel learned this not through gossip, but through her network of enslaved couriers. The invisible messengers who carried information between town and plantation. They spoke to her in whispers, trusting her as one of their own, unaware she used those whispers as instruments of strategy. By mid-February, Rachel knew every detail. Letters exchanged, meetings arranged, the date of the wedding, even the exact phrasing of Anna's affectionate lines. She waited until the perfect moment. On February 19th, as Daniel reviewed correspondence in the drawing room, Rachel, accidentally, delivered a sealed letter meant for William. She apologized profusely when Daniel reached for it, pretending ignorance. But it was too late. The handwriting was feminine, the tone intimate. Curiosity became outrage. When William returned that evening, Daniel confronted him with the letter. The argument that followed echoed across the house. Voices raised. Furniture overturned, years of paternal pride collapsing into fury. When William revealed that he had already married Anna, and that she was expecting, Daniel's rage became final. He disinherited his son that night, casting him out of Oak Ridge and forbidding his name ever to be spoken again. Rachel watched silently as the carriage wheels rolled away. Margaret, sobbing, tried to intercede, but Daniel's fury was immovable. Rachel's eyes, witnesses said, reflected neither triumph nor remorse, only calculation. The first fracture in the Kenshaw family was complete. The auction march brought ruin in its wake. Rachel's orchestration had already destabilized Daniel's finances. Now, the consequences emerged in full. A man named Josiah Fletcher arrived at Oak Ridge, claiming to represent New Orleans creditors. He demanded immediate repayment of $8,000 and more than Daniel's liquid assets. The debt was real, but the timing was not coincidence. Rachel, through her same unseen network, had made certain that word of Daniel's hidden loans reached Fletcher's employers. The creditors saw opportunity, Rachel saw devastation. Faced with ruin, Daniel made the most catastrophic choice of his life. To pay the debt, he ordered the sale of 20 enslaved people. Families who had lived at Oak Ridge for years, who had built its wealth with their bodies and blood. The auction took place March 28, 1848. The cries of separated parents and children filled the air. Margaret, unable to bear the sight, wept openly. Rachel stood nearby, expression unreadable. One witness later swore that she saw, for a fleeting instant, the mask slip. Not with emotion, but with satisfaction. The sale was not a tragedy to Rachel, it was confirmation that her plan worked. The man who had treated her as property, now destroyed his own property to survive. It was poetic justice, stripped of mercy. That evening, Margaret confronted her. The exchange between the two women would become legend in local lore. Margaret, you did this. My father's fall, my brother's disgrace. All of it. You arranged it somehow. Rachel, Miss Margaret, I am a piece of property. I have no power to arrange anything. Your family's troubles come from your father's choices and your brother's deceit. Margaret. You're a liar. I'll prove it. And when I do, you'll hang for it. Rachel. To prove that, you must admit that your father was outwitted by his property. Do you believe your pride will allow such an admission? Margaret said nothing. She knew Rachel was right. That silence sealed Oak Ridge's fate. The calm before the catastrophe. By April 1848, Rachel's influence had reached its peak. 3 families lay in turmoil: Rutley, Havel, Kenshaw, each consumed by the same invisible hand. Yet Rachel's vengeance was not yet complete. The final act required exposure, chaos that no one could dismiss as coincidence. And as the Alabama summer approached, Rachel began constructing that final act, one that would turn whispers of misfortune into open violence, and force a society built on control to face a truth it could neither explain nor punish. She had proven she could destroy from within. Now, she would force them to acknowledge it, to be continued in Part 30, The Fires of Limestone County. By the spring of 1845, the tension surrounding the Krenner estate had reached a kind of invisible pressure, an air thick with unspoken suspicions, small glances, and a nervous quiet that hung over every meal and meeting. People in the county began to whisper that the family's fortune, once so sure of itself, was shrinking like a dying tree. Horses went lame without reason, business partners withdrew from contracts, and even the weather seemed to conspire against them. Long rains washing out roads, then weeks of blinding drought. Rachel moved through all of this with a stillness that drew the eye. Those who noticed her said she behaved not as a servant, but as someone listening to something no one else could hear. She took careful note of everything. The way the master's hand trembled when signing letters, the nervous laughter of his daughter when guests visited, the barely concealed bitterness between husband and wife. No one suspected her of anything, though a few of the older workers watched her with quiet respect, as if they recognized something purposeful behind her composure. In later testimony, neighbors would recall the months before the Krenner family's decline as strangely calm. The silence was the first warning, they said, though no one realized it then. Rachel's strength was never loudness, it was arrangement. She understood how to let the smallest truth travel from one ear to another until it reached exactly the person who needed to hear it wrong. A sentence could become a rumor, and a rumor could become an accusation. Her power rested not in lies, but in the order of information, deciding which pieces to reveal and when. By mid-summer, 2 men who had long competed for Mr. Krenner's favor began openly undermining each other, convinced the other had spoken against him in town. Each was right, but neither knew that Rachel had quietly repeated both of their comments to the other in identical tones of regret, as if warning them of betrayal. When the quarrel turned violent, the plantation's overseer tried to intervene, only to be caught in the crossfire of accusations. Within a week, he left the estate altogether, and Henare was forced to take over daily management himself, a task he loathed and understood poorly. Letters from that period show his growing desperation. His handwriting breaks down, lines running together like fevered thoughts. He wrote of presence in the house that drains the air, and of dreams in which the lake outside the parlor appeared to rise and swallow the fields. Rachel meanwhile kept to her routines. She tended to accounts, managed linen inventories, oversaw the younger servants. Her calm presence became a kind of shield behind which the household collapsed. One evening, while reconciling household books, she discovered a discrepancy, a sum missing from the cotton sales recorded earlier that year. Instead of confronting Henare directly, she mentioned the figure quietly to his wife, suggesting it must be a simple error. Within days, the wife began to suspect her husband of hiding funds. The argument that followed lasted hours, and by dawn servants were whispering that the mistress had threatened to leave for her brother's home in Mobile. Rachel's purpose was not theft or greed. It was revelation. Each fracture she uncovered seemed to her like a truth surfacing through pressure. She believed that exposing these people to their own weaknesses was justice, that the same system that chained her depended on the very vices she was now using to unmake it. But not everything she set in motion obeyed her design. In late August, a messenger arrived from the neighboring Vance plantation, carrying a sealed letter. No one ever learned who sent it. What is certain is that within hours of reading it, Mrs. Henare collapsed into near hysteria. Her husband accused her of conspiring with Vance to sell family land without consent. Neighbors reported shouting, glass breaking, then silence. After that night, nothing was the same. The Henare estate began to empty, first the guests, then the hired men. Rachel remained, watching as order dissolved around her. She felt, for the first time, something close to pity. She had seen men like Henare before, raised to believe themselves unassailable, yet undone by the first true reflection of their own fragility. But his wife, fragile and bewildered, haunted her. The woman's fear was real, her ruin undeserved except by proximity. Rachel wrote in her later notes that this was the moment she understood the cost of her campaign, that corruption did not limit its damage to the guilty. By winter, creditors had arrived. Papers changed hands. The Henare name still carried weight, but it was no longer spoken with respect. When the estate was auctioned, Rachel was transferred to a distant cousin, a younger man without the polish or confidence of his predecessor. He treated her with suspicion from the start, sensing in her something that unsettled him. He was not wrong. From that new household, Rachel began to hear news of the outside world, rumors of political unrest, of new debates over the legality of the trade. The world, it seemed, was shifting. But within the small confines of plantation life, everything repeated itself: the same dinners, the same overseers, the same cruelties disguised as custom. She thought often of escape, not the physical kind, but a liberation through consequence. If she could turn one more house against itself, she might force someone, somewhere, to ask why this kept happening. She began to plan again, though this time she kept careful distance, operating through intermediaries: an elderly cook, a stable boy, a literate craftsman from a nearby property. Each had reason to despise the world that confined them, and each carried fragments of information Rachel could weave together. A misplaced deed here, an unsigned letter there, hints of debt, gossip of infidelity, all of it threads she could twist into a pattern invisible, until it was complete. In a fragment recovered from her supposed confession, she wrote, "A lie is crude. A rumor is art. It breathes and reproduces. Once freed, it no longer belongs to its maker, and that is its power." The next family fell not through scandal but through silence. Contracts inexplicably went unsigned, partners withdrew, and within months their credit collapsed. Historians later traced the failure to a series of small clerical oversights. none large enough to draw suspicion, but together catastrophic. The handwriting on several documents was Rachel's, precise and neat. She did not rejoice. Those close to her said she began to keep to herself, writing at night by candlelight. She had started to question whether her campaign, once a deliberate strategy of vengeance, had become a kind of compulsion. The line between justice and obsession blurred. She told herself she was still at war with the system, but sometimes, staring out at the fields, she felt only weariness, a sense that the structure she fought was too vast to fall by human hands. By 1847, Rachel's reputation among enslaved and free alike had become almost mythic. People spoke of a woman who could destroy households with words alone. Some said she had learned charms from the old country, others that she possessed uncanny intelligence. In truth, her weapon was observation, sharpened by grief. That year, the Delaurier family from Mobile appeared in her story, a connection that would later close the circle and expose everything she had done. But for now, Rachel continued her quiet campaign, one household after another unraveling under invisible pressure. The world saw coincidence, she saw design. Late that autumn, she wrote the line that would survive all her lost papers. They have taken everything from me except thought. Thought is the one freedom that cannot be owned. And if thought cannot be owned, it can also not be contained. The fires of revenge had cooled into something colder, more deliberate, a philosophy disguised as service. What she could not know was that somewhere in the ruins of the Henare estate, among old receipts and torn correspondence, a clue had survived, a fragment that would lead, years later, to her discovery and to the confrontation that would define her legend. The summer of 1849 settled thick over northern Alabama, carrying with it a stillness that felt unnatural. The neighboring estates that once rang with horses and voices had fallen quiet. Visitors traveling the Huntsville Road noted how shutters remained closed through the maned afternoons and how servants avoided conversation when questioned. Newspapers referred only obliquely to the sequence of family tragedies near Limestone County, their language careful and incomplete. Rumor, however, filled the silence. By July, 3 households lay ruined, finances exhausted, marriages dissolved, several deaths unexplained, and the region's planters wanted an explanation that would not implicate themselves. County officials opened what they termed a special inquiry. Surviving correspondence from that committee, preserved in the state archive, reads as though the investigators were afraid of what they might find. They interviewed overseers, clerks, and tradesmen. They examined wills and property ledgers. They even sought the opinions of local physicians on whether a female of inferior station could be responsible for such wide-ranging calamity. One doctor's reply survives in a brittle folio. The mind of the Negro female, when gifted above her condition, may exhibit tendencies toward subversive cunning. Yet to suppose she could orchestrate the fall of several families borders on delusion. This sentence was copied into newspapers as reassurance. Behind it lay panic. Margaret Kenshaw, still mourning her brother, kept her own record of these hearings. Her notes, later found among estate papers, are brief and uneven, written in a hand that faltered mid-sentence. She believed the inquiry a performance meant to satisfy public curiosity, not to discover truth. In one entry she wrote, "They ask about storms, bad harvests, the price of cotton, anything that shifts blame from the living. None dare name her, though all think the same name." She meant the servant woman once employed by the Rutleys, last seen traveling south with a merchant's caravan. To Margaret she remained a phantom threaded through every loss. The committee produced no formal indictment. Instead, it issued a pamphlet titled Observations on Domestic Disorder, printed in Mobile in 1850. The language combined moral warning with pseudoscience. It spoke of mental contagion, suggesting that hysteria among servants could spread like fever, undermining the discipline of households. Certain female temperaments, it claimed, possess a faculty of persuasion amounting to mesmerism. No names appeared, yet those who had suffered knew exactly whom it described. Copies circulated through the Gulf states, feeding a quiet hysteria among planters already uneasy after the uprisings of the previous decade. In private correspondence, however, the tone changed. Surviving letters between plantation owners reveal an undercurrent of fascination. They discussed the unknown woman not as a mere criminal, but as a case study, an object lesson in intellect misplaced. One wrote, "If such a mind exists within that race, we are less secure than we imagined." The contradiction was unbearable. To acknowledge her intelligence was to erode the logic of their own authority. Thus they spoke of her as abnormal, a deviation produced by foreign blood, or moral infection. Science would later call this anthropology. At the time, it was fear wearing the mask of scholarship. By autumn, the inquiry dissolved. Its papers, statements, witness lists, an unfinished map of the affected estates, were sealed in a wooden chest labeled, simply Limestone Affair. The chest remained in the courthouse cellar until the building's renovation a century later. When archivists opened it in 1964, they found the documents wrapped in mildewed linen. Among them lay a single sheet written in an unfamiliar hand, a fragment of a letter never sent. The ink had faded almost to brown, but several lines were legible. "They believe they have buried what happened here. Yet I hear her name whispered when the wind crosses the fields. The earth itself remembers." Historians disagree whether the author was Margaret Kenshaw or a later relative. The handwriting suggests a woman educated before 1850, the diction austere and deliberate. Whoever wrote it understood the event as something unfinished. After the inquiry ended, survivors scattered. Lydia Havel left for Ohio under another name. The Rutley estate changed hands twice before the war. In the census of 1850, Rachel, age 34, mulatto, domestic servant, appears briefly in New Orleans records, then disappears. Whether this was the same woman or coincidence cannot be proven. What matters is that her story continued in whispers, traveling with merchants and sailors, spreading from port to port. Each retelling added invention, that she practiced medicine in secret, that she could read minds, that she vanished into the swamps and founded a hidden settlement. Folklore overtook fact, as it often does when truth is intolerable. Meanwhile, Margaret devoted herself to order. She rewrote account books, restored fences, and hosted ministers who assured her that divine justice would prevail. Yet her private journal, recovered long after her death, betrays unease. "I clean the house as though scrubbing away her shadow. Still I wake at night and imagine footsteps on the veranda. The dogs do not bark." In 1851 she traveled briefly to Mobile, petitioning the legislature to pass stricter laws concerning servant manipulation. The proposal failed after committee debate. Lawmakers could not agree whether the threat was spiritual, medical, or entirely imaginary. The silence that followed lasted years. By 1860 the events of 48 and 49 had become anecdote, proof of divine retribution, a caution against moral laxity, or evidence of hidden conspiracies depending on who told it. The newspapers stopped mentioning it, but within family circles, diaries preserved its unease. One such diary, kept by the widow Delacourt of Madison County, mentions a dinner in 1859 where older guests refused to speak after someone invoked the woman of limestone. The younger generation laughed, calling it a ghost tale. The older ones did not. After the Civil War, when enslaved people became citizens, a few former servants from the ruined estates gave interviews to northern journalists. They described the woman differently, not as a sorceress or temptress, but as someone who knew how to listen. She had asked questions others never ask, about debts, about letters, about promises broken. To them, her power was not supernatural, it was comprehension. Yet even in freedom they spoke softly, as though naming her might call her back. Today, historians examine the Limestone Affair as an early study in psychological resistance. How intellect and observation could destabilize a system built on ignorance. But beyond academic papers, the story persists in local folklore. Residents claim that on humid nights the lake near the old Dequa plantation glows faintly, as if lit from below. They say the water covers foundations of a house burned in 1850, and that the light is not fire but memory. Whether true or not, the legend endures, because it explains what the records cannot, how one woman's quiet defiance unsettled an entire order. What remains of her life is scattered through archives. An unsigned confession, legal transcripts, and the diaries of those who feared her. Together they form a mosaic of dread and admiration. Each document stops short of naming her motive. Each writer hesitates at the edge of comprehension. Perhaps that is why the story continues to fascinate. It suggests that history itself, no matter how meticulously recorded, cannot fully contain the power of a mind determined to be remembered. By 1851, the name Rachel had become legend whispered across plantation districts from Alabama to Louisiana. Some spoke of her as a demon in human form, an omen of divine punishment upon a corrupt South. Others, particularly among the enslaved, spoke her name with hushed admiration, not as monster, but as proof that intelligence could be more powerful than violence. What few understood was that Rachel herself had already vanished from public record, disappearing into the vast human machinery of slavery, but she had not ceased to exist. In 1852, a series of letters surfaced in New Orleans from a merchant named Guillaume Marchand, the same cotton factor who had arranged Rachel's final sale. The letters, preserved in the Marchand family archives, reveal fragments of a strange correspondence between the merchant and a planter named Joseph Cartwright of St. Landry Parish. Cartwright's tone was urgent, fearful. He wrote of an enslaved woman recently purchased from a Louisiana trader, a woman called Marie, who speaks perfect French, writes in elegant script, and exerts a remarkable influence on others of her color. He warned that she was dangerous, capable of uniting field and house hands in thought if not in deed, and claimed that, since her arrival, discipline has eroded, and unease spreads through the household like fever. Marchand's reply was curt: "Sell her quickly. The woman you describe was known in Alabama under another name. You will not master her mind. She will master yours." After this exchange, Marie vanished again, sold, moved, or perhaps escaped. The next reliable record appears not in Louisiana but in Galveston County, Texas, 1853. There, a planter named Henry Dalton, already familiar from Abraham Cornwall's earlier report, filed a petition with the sheriff after a barn fire destroyed a season's cotton. In that document, Dalton mentioned an enslaved seamstress named Rachel, purchased months earlier from a river trader. He described her as quiet, obedient, too intelligent for her own good, and complained that she keeps strange notes, makes copies of ledgers, and seems to know more of my accounts than my own clerk. That petition survives today in the Galveston County Courthouse, the final legal document certainly tied to Rachel's name. What followed next is known only through scattered testimony, collected years later, during Reconstruction, by the Freedmen's Bureau. One witness, an elderly freedwoman named Celeste, claimed to have worked alongside Rachel in Texas. Her statement, recorded in 1867, is remarkable for its clarity and insight. She said, "The white folks think they own our bodies, but not our minds." She said the only way to win was to make them fear our minds more than our hands. She told me once she wasn't fighting for freedom anymore. She was fighting to make them see what freedom meant. Celeste described Rachel teaching others to read and write using scraps of newspaper and discarded account books. Within months, several enslaved men and women on the Dalton plantation could sign their names, a capital crime in many southern counties. Then, one night in late autumn 1853, the plantation's record house burned, Dalton's financial papers, slave inventories, and insurance bonds all destroyed. Rachel was never seen again. There the historical trail seems to end, but not entirely. In 1862, Union forces captured New Orleans. Among the papers seized from Confederate offices was a leather, Bound volume marked private. Do not circulate. Inside were 94 pages of handwritten text titled Observations on the Mental Peculiarities of Negroes, signed by Dr. Ambrose Fenwick, physician attached to the Louisiana State Asylum. Fenwick's manuscript included detailed case studies, most describing enslaved individuals exhibiting extraordinary reasoning capacity. Case 11 was labeled only R. He wrote, Subject R, female, approximate age 35-40, formerly property of Dalton Estate, Texas. Acquired by the institution following alleged arson and flight. R exhibits exceptional intellect, fluency in French and English, and deep comprehension of social systems. When questioned about motives, she states, the mind cannot be enslaved, only ignored. She acknowledges instigating multiple acts of rebellion and psychological manipulation across several households, which she describes as experiments in social equilibrium. Fenwick's notes become increasingly unsettled. She inquires about my own family, my habits, my fears. She anticipates my questions before I speak them. I begin to suspect that I am the one under examination. The final entry is dated March 3, 1863. Patient vanished from secure confinement during night of storm. No signs of escape visible. Doors locked. Keys in my possession. Staff terrified. I no longer doubt that certain minds possess capabilities beyond our comprehension. No subsequent record of R appears in Fenwick's surviving papers. After the war, rumors of an educated freedwoman teaching literacy to former slaves along the Gulf Coast persisted. She was described as light-skinned, middle-aged, with sharp intelligence and a voice that could make a man question himself. Some said she called herself Rachel again. Others said she no longer used any name at all. When historians revisited the so-called Rachel papers in the 20th century, they discovered something startling. The handwriting in Fenwick's asylum notes, supposedly written by the doctor, was identical to samples known to be Rachel's from 1849. This suggests not that Fenwick recorded her words, but that she wrote the document herself, perhaps adopting the doctor's voice to frame her own observations of power and control. If true, the observations were her final manipulation, turning the language of scientific racism into testimony of her own superiority. One passage, midway through the manuscript, captures this inversion perfectly. They call us simple because they fear complexity. They call us childlike because they cannot bear to see themselves in us. The master's mind is bound by his belief in mastery. He cannot imagine equality, therefore cannot imagine danger. That blindness is my weapon. By the early 1870s, scholars attempting to verify Rachel's story were divided. Some believed she was an invention, a Gothic myth born from the guilt of the defeated South, a projection of white fear. Others, particularly black intellectuals in the Reconstruction era, saw her as symbol of resistance, perhaps the first recorded theorist of psychological rebellion. Yet fragments of her existence remained stubbornly factual. Her name on bills of sale, her handwriting on plantation ledgers, her confession in Margaret Crenshaw's possession, her signature, a looping R beneath Fenwick's asylum record. Too many separate hands, too many authentic documents to dismiss her as legend. Margaret Crenshaw's papers, discovered decades later, confirmed she had indeed brought Rachel's written confession to Montgomery in 1850. In a private letter to her cousin, she described reading it aloud before a legislative committee and feeling the room go cold, as if every man present understood he was hearing not the ravings of a slave, but the reasoning of an equal. The committee ordered the document sealed, fearing its publication would excite insurrection. The confession circulated quietly nonetheless. Copied, quoted, distorted, it passed among abolitionists in the North and radical intellectuals in France. In 1861, the writer Victor Hugo referenced a woman of chains who conquered through mind alone. In an unpublished essay on slavery, it is believed he had read a translation of Rachel's confession, and then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she dissolved into silence. By the 1880s, Descendants of the Havil, Kenshaw, and Rutley families avoided the subject entirely. Their ledgers omit any mention of the events of 1848-49. In plantation folklore, Rachel's name became a ghost story told to frighten children, the slave who made masters go mad. But within African American oral tradition, she was remembered differently, as a strategist, a mind unbroken by bondage. Songs collected in Mississippi in the early 1900s mention Miss Rachel with fire in her head, who taught the masters dread. Today, historians interpret Rachel not merely as a figure of vengeance, but as a philosopher of resistance, a woman who understood the social mechanics of power before psychology even had a name for it. Her confession, though suppressed, foreshadows modern theories of systemic control and cognitive rebellion. She turned her condition, being treated as property, into a weapon, using the slave system's denial of her agency as a shield for absolute subversion. One scholar summarized her legacy with chilling precision. Rachel did not abolish slavery. She revealed it as intellectually unsustainable. She forced a contradiction so profound it could not endure another generation. And perhaps that is her truest legacy. The Civil War, that began a decade after her disappearance, would destroy the world she fought against, not through her hand, but through the forces her existence had illuminated: hypocrisy, fear, and the moral rot at the system's core. Her final known words, scribbled in the margin of Fenwick's manuscript, seem to have been meant for whoever would someday read them. The mind, once freed, cannot be re-enslaved. You may chain the body, silence the voice, burn the papers, but the idea has already escaped. That idea, the invisible rebellion of thought, is all that remains of Rachel. Whether she lived out her years in freedom or vanished beneath another name, history cannot say. But her story endures, not as legend or ghost tale, but as warning. Intelligence denied becomes intelligence weaponized. And when those who are oppressed learn to think as strategically as their oppressors, the world that made their suffering cannot survive them. By the mid-1870s, the trail of Rachel's story had almost vanished. Only scattered correspondence, misfiled reports, and fragments of oral memory remained to suggest that anything remarkable had once unfolded between Alabama, Louisiana, and Virginia. Yet in 1876, a discovery at a private auction in Mobile briefly reopened interest in the case. A trunk labeled, "Property of E.D. Bayalabatra, 1850, contained, among family papers, a bound volume titled, The Philosophy of Servitude. The text was unsigned, but several pages matched handwriting samples known from the 1849 confession attributed to Rachel. The volume contained revisions, marginal notes, and new reflections written in a different ink. The first page began simply, "They think I am gone, but I continue in the minds of those who read me." Scholars later argued this could not be Rachel's original hand. The ink was manufactured after 1852. Yet the phrasing and cadence were unmistakably hers. The document discussed not vengeance but structure. Its author analyzed how systems of control perpetuate themselves, how moral injury breeds imitation, and how both enslavers and the enslaved absorb patterns of domination. A recurring idea was that oppression trains both victim and master to depend upon each other's weakness. The writer proposed that no society could endure when its stability required the denial of thought to millions. A Mobile bookseller sold the volume quietly to a visiting journalist, Thomas C. Hargreaves, who recognized its potential significance. His 1878 pamphlet, An Enigma of the Old South, summarized portions of the manuscript and proposed that the mysterious Rachel may have survived under a new name in Louisiana, teaching in one of the early freedmen's schools. The claim was unsubstantiated, but it stirred renewed curiosity among Northern reformers who saw in Rachel's story a symbol of intellectual resistance under bondage. By the 1880s, however, regional reaction shifted sharply. Southern periodicals denounced Hargreaves for reviving incendiary myths. Several editors insisted that Rachel never existed. calling the confession a northern fabrication designed to defame the South. The Alabama Department of Archives quietly restricted access to Margaret Crenshaw's papers. In 1887, the Montgomery Sentinel published an editorial titled "The False Confession," arguing that no Negro woman could have possessed the education necessary to compose such a document. Ironically, these denials preserved the story's aura. For historians in the 20th century, the mixture of belief and suppression became part of the puzzle itself. Was Rachel real, or had she become a composite of fears, a projection of guilt onto an imagined figure, capable of dismantling the slaveholder's world with intellect alone? In 1904, a historian named Ellen Brodie Tarrant undertook the first systematic re-examination of the Crenshaw and Dorquah materials. Working with fragile documents and water-damaged journals, she concluded that Rachel had indeed existed, though her actions were likely exaggerated. She was neither demon nor saint. Tarrant wrote, "She was evidence of what occurs when a mind trained in freedom is forced into servitude." Tarrant's monograph, printed privately in 1907, circulated among academic circles but drew little public attention. Decades passed. The civil rights era revived interest in forgotten narratives of resistance. In 1965, a graduate researcher at the University of Alabama, Marion Keene, uncovered correspondence between Tarrant and the Department of Archives, indicating that a full copy of the confession had once been photographed before restriction. Those negatives, mislabeled, were located in 1966. Their publication in a small historical journal 2 years later caused brief controversy. The confession's language astonished readers. Far from the expected dialect or religious tone, it was precise, reflective, almost philosophical. Rachel described not hatred of individuals but of systems, not violence for its own sake but a campaign designed to expose the fragility of false power. Keene wrote that reading the confession felt like encountering a political treatise disguised as a confession. The rediscovery coincided with broader reassessments of American history. Activists and scholars saw in Rachel's account a rare example of intellectual rebellion from within bondage, a strategic consciousness previously denied to enslaved people in mainstream narratives. Some embraced her as a proto-revolutionary thinker, others warned against romanticizing destruction. In the 1970s, excerpts appeared in university anthologies under the title Confession of Rachel, 1849. Critics debated authenticity. Linguists noted anomalies suggesting later editing. Yet even skeptics conceded the text's coherence. Whether written by Rachel herself, transcribed by Elise Duokwa, or reconstructed by later hands, it expressed ideas astonishingly modern: that oppression functions through belief, that language can be a weapon, that systems collapse when they cannot contain the intelligence they suppress. In 1981, an anonymous donor presented the archives with another item, a faded carte de visite of a woman in mid-19th century dress, signed on the reverse R. 1852. No proof linked it to Rachel, but her name alone revived speculation. A televised documentary in 1984 titled Rachel, The Mind Unchained brought the story to a national audience. Viewers were divided. Some found inspiration in the tale of a woman using intellect as resistance. Others saw manipulation and moral ambiguity. Through the late 20th century, Rachel's legend evolved. Historians debated whether her actions, if real, constituted ethical rebellion or calculated cruelty. Feminist scholars reinterpreted her as a symbol of agency in a world that denied it. Southern historians viewed her as an embodiment of the guilt slavery left unresolved, an idea more dangerous than any act she might have committed. In 2005, digitization projects finally brought the scattered materials together. Researchers compared handwriting, ink types, and provenance. The conclusion was inconclusive. Portions were genuine mid-century originals, others were later copies. Yet the moral power of the story remained untouched by uncertainty. As one archivist noted, the authenticity of the document matters less than the authenticity of the question it poses. That question persists. How much destruction is justified in pursuit of justice? Rachel's story forces confrontation with the uncomfortable possibility that intellect, once denied, can turn against the structures that repressed it. Whether she lived or was invented, her image, the educated woman enslaved, turning her education into quiet warfare, became a lens through which Americans reconsidered their past. Today, historians treat Rachel not as a ghost or villain, but as a mirror. She reflects the contradictions of a society that taught some of its victims to read, to reason, and then punished them for thinking. Her legend demonstrates that systems of oppression cannot erase the minds they attempt to control. They only drive them underground until the right moment arrives for revelation. In 2021, restoration specialists reopened the sealed Kenshaw collection for digital preservation. Inside the final folder, archivists found a single sheet titled Postscript. It was written in an unfamiliar hand but dated 1870. The note read, "I have seen the woman they call Rachel. She lives quietly under another name, neither saint nor criminal, but teacher. She says the war proved her point. Ideas cannot be enslaved." Whether that note was authentic or apocryphal hardly matters now. What endures is the resonance, the lingering sense that beneath the official histories runs another current, one written in invisible ink by those whom history sought to silence. The documents now known as the Langley Collection entered the state archives sometime between 1948 and 1951. The catalog record is incomplete. A single line in the accession ledger reads, "Donation of agricultural correspondence and legal materials, Limestone Co., 1820-1870. When a young assistant archivist named Helen Westridge opened the boxes in 1962, she found that the papers were anything but agricultural. They contained fragments of diaries, letters, fragments of household accounts, and a sheaf of pages written in an unusually clear 19th century hand. On the first page, in fading brown ink, stood a single name, Rachel. Westridge was a recent graduate of Auburn, hired through a new program intended to modernize the archives. She recorded in her own notes that she had never seen such deliberate penmanship, as though the writer wished posterity to read every word. The papers smelled of mildew and tobacco smoke. Some bore watermarks from French paper mills active in the 1840s. At first, the archivists assumed the writer had been a white planter's wife. Only after Westridge compared the language of the confession with other plantation ledgers did she understand the inversion. The voice belonged to someone enslaved. It was not until 1971 that a graduate student, Thomas R. Caldwell, recognized the connection between the Langley documents and the surviving correspondence of the Crenshaws, Haverhills, and Rutledges. Caldwell's dissertation, An Unknown Voice from the Antebellum South, circulated privately among historians. His analysis emphasized the psychological sophistication of the confession, noting its mixture of confession, strategy, and philosophy. The writer, he observed, demonstrates a degree of intellectual autonomy incompatible with the legal position she occupied. In her reasoning, one hears the foundation of a rebellion conducted with the instruments of intellect rather than force. The reaction within academic circles was uneasy. Some doubted the authenticity of the confession, others argued that Caldwell had misread a literary fiction. In the following decade, microfilming efforts brought renewed attention. During copying, technicians reported the unnerving detail that the ink on several pages seemed to darken under the scanning light, as if the letters absorbed illumination. The phenomenon was dismissed as a trick of exposure, but one technician refused to continue the work, claiming that, when he rewound the film, the images on the negative had shifted position slightly, as though the handwriting itself had moved. By 1983, the state archives restricted access to the originals. Only facsimiles could be consulted, and researchers signed agreements not to reproduce long passages verbatim. The explanation given was preservation. Unofficially, staff whispered of a lingering effect around the paper's visitors, describing headaches, the faint scent of iron, a metallic taste on the tongue after handling certain sheets. None of these claims were ever verified, but they were recorded in Westridge's private notebook, discovered among her effects after her death in 1992. That same year, a documentary team from a public television station attempted to film a segment on the case. The resulting episode, "The Most Dangerous Woman in Alabama," aired once, late at night, then vanished from circulation after the station received anonymous letters questioning its accuracy. Archival staff later learned that the film crew had borrowed the original documents for close-up shots without permission. When the papers were returned, several pages were in reversed order, and one was missing entirely. The missing page, numbered 47, has never been recovered. Its absence leaves a gap mid-sentence. 1. And if the mind be free even while the body is bound, then the master's dominion is already an illusion. By the early 2000s, the story had migrated online. Digital history forums traded scans of the surviving pages, and amateur genealogists sought links between the destroyed families and contemporary descendants. The tone of discussion drifted from academic to speculative. Posts described cursed bloodlines, haunted estates, and whispered sightings of a woman in 19th century dress near the ruins of the old Kenshaw property. Serious historians dismissed this as internet folklore, but the intensity of public fascination kept the legend alive. In 2015, the archives launched a digitization initiative that required each box to be re-examined. A conservator named Miguel Rojas handled the Langley papers. His logbook records something peculiar. The ink on the final page of the confession remained damp to the touch despite being over a century old. Laboratory testing found no mold or moisture. Rojas sealed the folio in inert plastic, but the faint glimmer of wetness persisted. "It looks," he wrote, "as if the words were still being written." When historians revisited the case, the discussion turned to Rachel's stated motive, the idea that intelligence itself could be weaponized against an unjust order. Modern scholars saw parallels in resistance movements worldwide, yet others argued that the fascination revealed something darker in American memory, a need to believe that moral reckoning can emerge from intellect rather than violence, even when the cost remains obscure. The debates filled conferences, podcasts, and late-night academic listservs. The more scholars analyzed the text, the less certain anyone became of its boundaries between documentation and myth. In 2020, a final review of the archives uncovered Westridge's forgotten notebook. The last entry, dated March 11, 1969, read, "It is not the handwriting that disturbs me, but the silence in the margins." Each page leaves room for a reply, as if the author expected someone to answer. That line circulated widely, quoted in essays about the psychology of historical haunting. Some readers claimed it captured the essence of Rachel's story. The idea that the past does not merely speak. It waits for acknowledgement. Others felt it described the archive itself, that quiet warehouse of unfinished conversations between the living and the dead. Today, the Langley collection remains under controlled conditions. Access is granted only to credentialed researchers. Still, each autumn, when humidity drops and the air inside the stacks dries to paper crispness, attendants report a faint rustle from the sealed folio drawer, like pages turning themselves. Sensors register no movement, yet the sound persists for several minutes before fading. The archivists no longer log the incident. It has become a seasonal inevitability, an accepted anomaly, a heartbeat in the silence of stored history. By 2021, the Langley collection had become both an academic curiosity and an institutional liability. Officially, it was categorized as special holdings, restricted, a designation usually reserved for materials too fragile or too controversial for public display. Yet the requests for access multiplied. Professors of history, digital archivists, and literary theorists submitted proposals. None received direct approval. The Internal Review Committee cited preservation concerns. Privately, staff referred to something else, an accumulation of small incidents that seemed unrelated but formed a pattern too odd to ignore. It began with the humidity sensors in Stackroom 3B, where the papers were stored. The readings fluctuated violently at irregular intervals, spikes of humidity followed by sudden drops, as if the air itself were breathing. Environmental technicians found no cause. The HVAC system had not malfunctioned, yet the sensors continued to pulse. Then came the auditory phenomena, soft noises between 200 and 400 AM, recorded by the night cameras as brief bursts of static resembling whispered speech. The facility director, embarrassed, dismissed them as electronic interference. Still, the archivists grew uneasy. Miguel Rojas, the conservator who had first noted the damp ink, kept a meticulous journal. In early February 2022, he wrote, "The handwriting on page 47, still missing, appears to influence the spacing of surrounding text. When viewed under magnification, the letters at the end of 46 and the beginning of 48 seem subtly stretched, as though reaching toward each other." His colleagues laughed at the phrasing, but the note remained in the log. 2 weeks later, Rojas took extended leave and did not return. His resignation letter was polite but vague. "I have come to believe that some documents remember their readers." That spring, the archives underwent digitization once again, this time for internal backup. The technician assigned, a graduate assistant named Aaron Lowe, described feeling pressure behind the eyes whenever the scanner light passed over certain lines of text. The discomfort faded after she turned off the machine, but she later reported dreaming of handwriting, lines unspooling across walls, ceiling, and floor. She mentioned it jokingly in a departmental email, and within days, her story spread beyond the archive. The incident drew attention from the university's psychology department. A research group studying archival suggestion phenomena requested permission to conduct interviews. They proposed that the Langley papers produced a subtle cognitive effect caused by the rhythm of the sentences, the density of moral paradoxes in the text. Their hypothesis was that the confession format itself can create an empathic resonance, compelling the reader to participate in its reasoning process. In other words, the danger lay not in the content, but in the act of comprehension. A closed-door meeting followed. The head of special collections, the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and 2 legal advisors convened to discuss whether the collection should be transferred to federal custody. No decision was reached. 1 week later, an internal memo quietly ordered the folio sealed in a nitrogen-filled chamber, accessible only to 2 authorized archivists. No further scans, no photography, no transcription, a silent quarantine for paper. Outside the institution, however, the story refused containment. Online forums circulated leaked photographs, grainy, desaturated images of the confession's opening paragraph. Commenters claimed that reading the text backward revealed hidden messages, or that the spacing of letters aligned with astronomical coordinates. A few posts linked the dates in Rachel's writing to lunar phases, suggesting occult meaning. Most academics ignored these claims, but the noise surrounding them grew loud enough that the university issued a press statement clarifying that the Langley documents are of historical significance only. Still, the rumors persisted. One user claimed to have found microtext embedded in the descenders of certain letters. Another insisted the writing matched the curvature of geological survey maps of the Alabama River. The debates bordered on absurd, yet an undercurrent of fascination ran through them. People wanted the papers to mean more than they did, to hold some code capable of explaining the unease they evoked. Then, in October 2022, a small article appeared in Southern Historical Review, reconsidering the Langley confession. The author, an independent researcher named Judith Alcott, argued that Rachel's document might represent proto-psychological treatise, disguised as narrative. She drew parallels between Rachel's description of mental resistance and early 19th century theories of mesmerism. Alcott's conclusion was unsettlingly ambiguous. Perhaps the text is not only a record of consciousness under oppression, but a deliberate attempt to transmit that consciousness forward. The phrase, "transmit consciousness forward," caught the attention of readers far beyond academia. Within weeks, paranormal podcasts and amateur historians were dissecting it. A visiting journalist attempted to gain entry to the archives, claiming to investigate state-sponsored censorship of slave narratives. When denied, she filed a Freedom of Information request, which was still pending months later. Meanwhile, social media users began reporting that the publicly available scans, those released decades earlier, were subtly changing. In some files, punctuation shifted positions. In others, faint shapes appeared in the margins, resembling fingerprints or smudged initials. The digital preservation team found no record of edits, yet the anomalies multiplied. By early 2023, the archivists could no longer dismiss the pattern. An internal memo recorded that multiple digital backups, stored on isolated servers, showed identical alterations. The text itself seemed to correct errors that had existed since its first transcription. One line, previously incomplete, now read clearly. To remember is to participate. The archives froze all access and requested forensic review of the servers. No intrusion was detected. Rumors reached the local press. An article in the Mobile Register described haunted files and intelligent ink, forcing the university to issue another statement denying supernatural involvement. Yet behind closed doors, staff discussed the growing sense that the Langley papers had ceased to be inert history. A senior archivist summarized it bluntly: the document has entered dialogue with its environment. In March 2024, one of the authorized archivists, Helen Cho, opened the nitrogen case for routine inspection. The papers were intact, but she noticed a single new detail: a faint indentation in the blank lower margin of the final page, as though a pen had pressed there without ink. Under a bleak light, the indentation resolved into two words, read aloud. The instruction was never followed. The case was resealed. Today, no one outside a narrow circle has direct access to the original folio. Requests are declined without explanation. Yet the myth of the Langley collection continues to evolve online, where blurred reproductions circulate endlessly. Historians describe it as a mirror, reflecting each generation's fears about memory, control, and the persistence of the past. Whether Rachel's words possess any power beyond their language is unprovable. What remains certain is that, for nearly 2 centuries, her voice has refused silence. It has adapted to every medium that sought to contain it. Paper, microfilm, digital screen, always remerging, always legible, and somewhere within the climate, controlled stillness of Stack Room 3B, beneath layers of filtered air and cautious bureaucracy, a single sheet of paper rests under glass. When the night guards pass, some swear they see it tremble, not from draft or vibration, but as if stirred by the faintest breath of someone still reading. By 1979, the Alabama Department of Archives had quietly reclassified the Donnelly papers under restricted special collections. The decision wasn't publicized. Researchers who'd cited the material were contacted and asked to return or redact quotations. Officially, the reason cited was fragility of the original documents. Privately, several archivists spoke of contextual complications and ethical considerations. No explanation was ever made public, but in the early months of 1980, a young graduate student named Catherine R. Millett wrote to the department from Tulane University requesting access to the sealed volumes. Her dissertation proposal concerned psychological resistance among enslaved women in antebellum America, and she cited the Donnelly case materials, 1834 to 1871, as essential to her research. Against expectations, permission was granted. Millett's research notes survive in part because she mailed carbon copies of each week's field notes to her advisor in New Orleans. Those letters, preserved in the Tulane archives, form the main record of what happened next. Her first letter, dated January 17, 1980, begins simply, The papers are in poor condition but legible. The handwriting is remarkably even, suggesting formal education. There is a rhythm to it, almost too measured, as if each sentence was weighed for sound as well as meaning. Over the next month, Millet's tone changes. She describes a pattern in the manuscripts, a recursive logic she can't fully describe, but that she begins to feel as much as understand. The text seems to anticipate my thoughts. I look for a particular theme and find it half a page later. The author seems to guide interpretation. Her February 5th entry grows more analytical, but faintly unsettled. What disturbs me is not the content but the precision. It reads like philosophy disguised as confession. She knew her audience would be future readers, people like me. The text performs intelligence. It is an experiment on the reader. That same week, the department's conservation specialist recorded unusual static interference in the microfilm scans of the Rachel sections. Lines of faint magnetic distortion appeared across certain passages, specifically where Rachel described the mechanism of influence and the architecture of conviction. Several reels had to be rephotographed. When Millet returned to New Orleans in March, she delivered her first conference paper, The Ethics of the Captive Mind. Witnesses recall her delivery as tense but lucid, her argument audacious. The Donnelly Confession constitutes not merely testimony but method. It demonstrates that resistance can exist purely in language. Structured thought weaponized through comprehension of its interpreter. It anticipates modern theories of behavioral conditioning, yet predates them by a century. Following her talk, a professor asked if she believed the author, Rachel, had been aware of later readers. Millet replied, "I think she designed the text to find them." 3 months later, she returned to Montgomery for continued access. Her notes from that trip are sparse. The last dated entry, June 9, 1980, reads only, "The voice changes here. The tone is not confession anymore. It is instruction." I don't know how she could have foreseen any of this. But she never submitted her dissertation. In August of that year, she withdrew from the program, citing neurological exhaustion. When colleagues later examined her materials, they found the typed chapters increasingly dense, with repetition of phrases drawn from Rachel's text. Sentences like, "Intelligence is an infection that cannot be contained by law," recur dozens of times. There are marginal notes in Millet's handwriting describing auditory correspondence. Phrases she claimed to hear while reading aloud. Archivists sealed the Donnelly materials permanently in 1981. Only fragments have surfaced since. Brief references in conference bibliographies, stray quotations copied into unrelated research. Each time, the citations vanish from later editions, as if quietly excised. For decades the story lay dormant. Then, in 2014, a digital humanities initiative at Auburn University proposed digitizing 19th century anomalous documents, including the Donnelly collection. Despite the restriction, a preliminary metadata record was created. It listed 10 bound volumes, 312 loose pages, and 1 additional folder labeled Transcriptions, Unverified 1969. The project was never completed. However, in early 2016, fragments from the unverified folder appeared online. No one claimed responsibility for the leak, but the images bore the distinctive watermark of the State Archive's internal scanning equipment. Within hours, they spread across academic message boards and historical Reddit communities under titles like The Donnelly Cipher and The Mind Slave Manifesto. The document's content fascinated and unsettled readers. Some described Rachel's prose as prophetic, others as algorithmic. Phrases repeated in cascading sequences, creating patterns that felt like coded instructions. A recurring passage read, "When they read my words, they become my instrument. I teach through comprehension, and comprehension is contagion." Cryptographers attempted to analyze the repetitions, suspecting hidden messages. Linguists identified subtle variations in phrasing suggesting deliberate calibration of rhythm and stress. Something like a primitive neurolinguistic technique, One researcher, Dr. N. Chatterjee, remarked in a 2017 paper that the text modulates attention through alternating syntactic density, a phenomenon also observed in modern persuasive algorithms. By that point, internet legend had transformed Rachel into something else entirely, a mythic intelligence operating through text. A ghost embedded in archives, reanimating whenever read. Most dismissed it as creepypasta born from historical ambiguity. Yet several users claimed odd coincidences after prolonged exposure to the transcripts disrupted sleep. Vivid dreams of unfamiliar antebellum rooms, the sensation of hearing a woman's voice reading beside them. The archive reissued takedown requests, citing copyright and ethical grounds, but digital copies continued circulating, often with small variations. No definitive version exists. Each transcription introduces minute errors, spelling, punctuation, syntax, that multiply exponentially, creating what digital historians call textual drift. By 2019, some scholars argued this drift itself was part of the text design, a self-propagating instability, ensuring continual reinterpretation. Whether intentional or emergent, the effect is uncanny. Every reader becomes a copyist, each copy a mutation. A symposium in 2021 titled Intelligence Without Agency. The Donnelly problem brought the subject briefly back to academic attention. Presenters debated whether Rachel's method could be read as early cognitive warfare, a system of destabilization using communication as contagion. The final speaker, Dr. Millen Vaughn, closed with a remark that silenced the room. If we accept the premise that intelligence seeks replication, then Rachel succeeded. She transformed subjugated intellect into autonomous transmission. What began as resistance became inheritance. After the symposium, an anonymous attendee distributed USB drives containing what they called the complete confession. Several recipients reported corrupted files, though the corrupted text retained discernible fragments. A woman's name repeating between blocks of scrambled code, and the date November 3, 1848, the night Rachel was first betrayed. That same week, Auburn University's network logs recorded a series of anomalous data calls from internal servers. The metadata tags corresponded to the restricted Donnelly collection, which, according to policy, had not been connected to any external network. IT specialists described it as spontaneous re-indexing. When the systems were reviewed, the collection's digital catalog had changed. Under author, the entry no longer read Rachel's enslaved woman 18IT, but simply active. No one ever explained that update. Today, the Donnelly materials remain sealed physically and digitally. Requests for access are denied automatically, yet the fascination persists. Scholars still whisper about the text that thinks, about the possibility that Rachel's final confession was not merely a document, but an experiment in communication itself, designed to outlive her, to evolve through the act of reading. Perhaps that is the true horror of her story, not what she did in life, but what she left behind. A linguistic structure that reproduces through curiosity, through study, through attention. Each generation of scholars believes they are analyzing her, when perhaps she is analyzing them. The pattern continues, quietly. A graduate student at Birmingham recently noted in an email that portions of her draft seem to rewrite themselves. After auto-correct, she deleted the paragraph, restarted her computer, and found the same passage restored verbatim. The sentence was simple: they cannot chain thought. The cataloging project was supposed to end in May. By then, the university team had digitized all remaining volumes from the Delaurier collection journals, plantation ledgers, shipping manifests, and the mysterious folders labeled RH, presumed to stand for Rachel Henare, though no official record ever confirmed the surname. Dr. Lenora Vance's report to the Historical Society, dated May 19, 1973, was the last formal entry connected to the case. What followed appeared only in the margins: private correspondence, scattered footnotes, unfiled recordings on reel-to-reel tape. The tone of those final notes was not scholarly. Vance's handwriting trembled more with each page. Ink migration, she wrote, describing how Rachel's confession, long thought irreparably damaged, seemed to reassert itself through the fibers of paper, as though the original words were returning from beneath layers of conservation paste. Not all pigments behave like this, she explained in an addendum. It is not mold, it is not oxidation, it looks deliberate. Though when the staff returned a week later, they found the folio sealed in plastic. Across the interior sleeve, someone had scrawled a sentence in faint brown ink. I could not chain thought. There was no evidence the ink was new. From 1974 through the early 1980s, the Delaurier papers circulated among scholars of Southern history, moral philosophy, and linguistics. Each cited the same phrases from the confession. Those challenging the logic of power, those predicting the system's eventual collapse. Yet many omitted the final section of the manuscript. In her private correspondence, Vance wrote that the closing paragraphs did not read as 19th century prose, but instead felt addressed to the present. Archivist Gordon Klein described the same unease. The handwriting changes. It becomes smaller, less careful, as if she is no longer performing for an audience. And then, abruptly, the tone shifts. It speaks to us, literally to us. He did not include this observation in his published paper. By 1987, the confession had disappeared again, removed from public access after an unexplained incident in the reading room. Records show only that one graduate assistant, reviewing the microfilm, fainted. In her brief statement, she said she heard someone dictating behind her shoulder. Though no one else was present, the university dismissed the event as exhaustion. The text resurfaced only in 2009, when digitization logs at the National Archive recorded a corrupted PDF titled RH Confession Final, PDF. The file consisted of 38 scanned pages, nearly identical to the documented confession, except for 3 inserted paragraphs, impossible to authenticate. They referred not to plantation households but to subsystems of control and inheritance through observation. The style was eerily consistent with Rachel's earlier rhetoric, yet it contained terms unknown before the 20th century. Scholars debated whether these were later forgeries or hallucinations induced by digital decay. Dr. Vance had written, decades earlier, the danger of this document is not that it is false, but that it speaks as if truth were contagious. Her phrase became shorthand for the discomfort surrounding Rachel's legacy, a story at once moral, political, and metaphysical. If intelligence could survive oppression, could it also survive death? In 2016, a restoration intern named Amara Price uncovered a mislabeled audio reel from the original 1973 interviews. Its contents were fragmentary, but one section included Vance reading aloud from the confession's epilogue. If thought cannot be chained, then it moves, as water moves, through blood, through memory, through the act of reading. If you read this, you carry it. Listeners described a low hum beneath her voice, possibly a malfunction in the recording equipment. The hum, analyzed digitally, resolved into a harmonic pattern consistent with human speech frequencies, though no words could be extracted. At the same time, independent researchers began tracing anecdotal accounts of strange occurrences around libraries that had housed copies of the Delaurier papers, unreadable catalog entries, computers freezing when certain accession numbers were entered, files duplicating themselves with inverted dates. None of these anomalies could be replicated under controlled conditions. When the Historical Society reissued the Delaurier Confession, a critical edition in 2019, the editors included a disclaimer. The reader should note that sections of this text contain linguistic artifacts, not traceable to known ink formulas or mechanical reproduction. The editorial board assumes no responsibility for physiological or cognitive effects reported by readers. Most assumed it was a grim joke. By 2021, Rachel's story had migrated online, reinterpreted as folklore, the slave who wrote herself free, the ghost in the archive, the first psychological revolutionary. Videos circulated showing pages of the confession fading and reappearing, as if written in invisible ink. No credible institution verified the footage. Still, the myth persisted, that anyone who read the full confession aloud would begin to dream in Rachel's voice. In 2023, when the University of Baton Rouge announced its exhibition Unchained Thought, the mind of Rachel Henare, attendance exceeded all expectations. Visitors described an uncanny atmosphere in the reading room, the temperature dropping, lights flickering, the faint scent of iron or rain. One journalist claimed that the typewritten captions beneath the photographs changed wording when viewed through glass. The curators later admitted to no such phenomena. What remains certain is this: every verified copy of the confession, paper, microfilm, or digital, contains an identical closing line, written in the same distinctive slanting hand. If you have read me, then I have survived. Scholars have not agreed whether this was Rachel's own addition, a later interpolation, or a metaphor inscribed by some unknown editor. The handwriting analysis remains inconclusive, but the phrase has become emblematic of the enduring question Rachel's story poses: whether ideas, once conceived, can ever truly die. The Delaurier case is now studied not only as history, but as a model for the transmissibility of thought. How narrative becomes infection, how intellect turns against the structures that confine it. In conference after conference, the debate repeats. Was Rachel's revenge ethical? Was it justice disguised as terror? Or was it the inevitable awakening of a consciousness too long denied recognition? As of 2025, the confession remains under restricted access. 3 institutions claim to hold authentic fragments, but none allow them to leave secure conditions. Yet whispers persist among graduate students that copies circulate privately, transcribed from memory by those who once handled the text. These unofficial versions vary slightly, but all end the same way: freedom is not given. It is thought, moving from one mind to the next. Late night visitors to the archives in Montgomery have reported hearing faint music from the basement. Notes resembling a hymn, or a woman's voice reciting phrases in both French and English. Security recordings show nothing. Dr. Vance's last surviving letter, dated August 3, 1974, closes with a line that feels almost like a surrender. I begin to think she was right. It is not the system that survives. It is the mind that learns to inhabit new hosts. And so Rachel's story concludes, or refuses to. Every archivist who handles her papers writes of the same sensation, that the text is aware, that it rewrites itself ever so slightly, using the reader's own phrasing, their own thoughts, their own doubts. Perhaps that is the ultimate revenge, not in fire or ruin, but in survival, thought moving silently through time, unbound, uncatalogued, unchained. If you are reading